My pops always said the land remembers, that its dirt held more stories than any book. He never warned me that some of those stories don't just whisper, they scream. They say the land remembers. My pops always said that, his voice raspy like dry corn husks. He'd be sitting on the porch swing, watching the sun bleed out over the western fields, and he'd say, "This dirt, it's got more stories in it than any book, boy. You just gotta be quiet enough to hear 'em." I was 18, and I mostly thought he was just being an old man, full of old man sayings. I'd nod and grunt, my mind on my truck or on Jenny Abernathy from down the road. I didn't know then that he was right. I didn't know that some stories aren't just whispered. Some of them scream. Our farm has been in the family for 5 generations, a sprawling, stubborn patch of Indiana soil that gives just enough to keep you going, but never enough to let you get comfortable. It's a life of early mornings, aching backs, and a constant low-grade anxiety tied to the whims of the weather. My world was measured in acres and bushels, and in the heart of that world was a 30-acre plot we called the Stubborn Acre. It was the bane of my father's existence, and his father's before him. The soil was rocky, the drainage was poor, and anything we planted there came up stunted and pale, like it had seen a ghost. Pop said the land there was sour. "Something bad happened on that patch," he'd say, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "The earth ain't forgot." That's where I was the day I found it. It was late August, the air thick and heavy with the smell of sun-baked dirt and dying sunflowers. The heat shimmered off the fields, making the horizon dance. I was on our old John Deere, trying to deep plow the Stubborn Acre, an annual exercise in futility my dad insisted on. The tractor roared, the diesel fumes making me dizzy, and the plowshares fought with the compacted earth. It was miserable work. I was sweating through my shirt, dreaming of a cold beer, when it happened. A sound. A deep, jarring clang that vibrated up through the steering wheel and into my bones. It wasn't the high-pitched scrape of a rock. This was different. Deeper. Metallic. The tractor lurched to a halt, the engine groaning in protest. I cursed, slamming the gear shift into neutral and killing the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the chirping of cicadas and the ticking of the cooling engine block. My first thought was that I'd broken a plowshare, which would mean an earful from Dad. I hopped down from the cab, my boots sinking into the freshly turned soil. I walked back to the plow and saw where it had snagged. One of the thick steel blades was wedged tight against something dark and unyielding just beneath the surface. I grabbed the shovel I kept strapped to the tractor and started digging around it, my frustration turning to curiosity. The ground was unnaturally hard here. My shovel rang against the object again and again. It was bigger than I thought. After about 20 minutes of grunting and sweating, I'd cleared enough dirt to see what I was dealing with. It was a box, or what was left of one. It was made of iron, I guessed, and it was covered in a thick, scaly blanket of orange and brown rust that flaked away under my fingers. It was maybe 3 feet long and 2 feet wide, and when I tried to lever it with the shovel, it barely budged. It was heavy, seriously heavy. A weird feeling started to creep up my spine. The sun was getting lower, casting long, distorted shadows across the field. The air, which had been so hot and still, was starting to stir with a cool evening breeze. I felt watched. I scanned the tree line at the edge of the property, then the empty expanse of the fields around me. Nothing. Just me and this thing I'd pulled from the earth. I should have left it. I should have gone back to the house, gotten my dad, and let him deal with it. That would have been the sensible thing to do. But I was 18. Sensible wasn't really my strong suit. This felt like mine. A secret the Stubborn Acre had decided to give only to me. My own story from the dirt. It took me another hour of hard labor, digging and prying, to finally work it free from the ground's grip. It came loose with a sucking sound, like the earth was reluctant to let it go. I managed to drag it out of the furrow and onto the flat, unplowed ground. I sat on my heels, breathing hard, just looking at it. It looked ancient. There was no lock, no hinges that I could see, just a thin, jagged line running around the top that suggested a lid. The entire surface was pitted and corroded, but as I ran my hand over it, I could feel faint, raised patterns beneath the rust. They weren't words or pictures, more like winding, geometric symbols that made no sense. They felt vaguely unsettling to touch. The sun was kissing the horizon now, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and purple. The world was getting quiet. I knew I had to get back, but the pull of the box was overwhelming. I had to know what was inside. I jogged back to the tractor and rummaged in the toolbox, coming back with a heavy-duty pry bar. I jammed the flattened end into the seam of the lid. I put my weight on it. Nothing. Just a grating sound of metal on rust. I repositioned it, found a better angle, and threw my entire body into it. The rust fought back, clinging to itself with the stubbornness of a century. The sun dipped lower. The breeze picked up, rustling the corn in the next field over. The sound was like whispering. I gritted my teeth and gave one last desperate heave. There was a loud, agonizing groan of tortured metal, a screech that seemed to echo across the silent field. Then, a sharp crack. The seal of rust broke. A puff of dusty, foul-smelling air escaped from the gap, and the lid shifted, lifting up by an inch. I'd done it. My heart was hammering in my chest, a mix of triumph and a sudden, inexplicable dread. I dropped the pry bar, my hands trembling slightly. I knelt down, took a deep breath, and gripped the edge of the heavy lid with my fingers. The metal was cold, colder than the evening air. It felt wrong. Dead. I pulled. The lid resisted for a second, then swung upwards on hidden, rusted-out hinges with a final, mournful squeal. And then it happened. The moment the inside of that box was exposed to the air, for the first time in God knows how long, the world went mad. The gentle breeze that had been whispering through the corn suddenly exploded into a violent, focused gust. It didn't come from the west with the setting sun. It felt like it erupted directly from the box itself. It was a physical force slamming into me, tearing at my clothes and hair. It was unnaturally cold, a pocket of deep winter in the humid August evening. But it wasn't the force or the cold that made me freeze, that made the blood turn to ice water in my veins. It was the sound. The wind wasn't just blowing, it was howling. And it wasn't the howl of a storm. It was the howl of a voice, a raw, guttural, agonized sound, a chorus of pain and rage and sorrow, all twisted into one impossible note that filled the air, the field, my head. It rushed past my ears and out across the stubborn acre, and the cornstalks bent low, not like they were being blown, but like they were bowing in terror. My eyes, wide with shock, finally focused on the dark interior of the box, expecting to see, I don't know what, bones, gold, something. But there was nothing. The box was empty, utterly, completely empty, filled only with shadows and the smell of rot and old grief. Empty, except for one small object, nestled right in the center, on a bed of what looked like blackened, dried leaves. It was a doll, carved from a single piece of dark, almost black wood, so old the grain was worn smooth in places. It was small enough to fit in the palm of my hand, a crude, sexless figure, with stick-like limbs and a round, featureless head. No, not entirely featureless. 2 tiny mismatched buttons had been sewn on for eyes. One was a pearly white, the other a flat, chipped black. It gave the little figure a lopsided, unnervingly knowing expression. Its tiny mouth was just a simple, downturned carved line, a permanent mark of sorrow. The wind, the impossible, screaming wind, died as suddenly as it had begun, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. The cornstalks straightened up, rustling softly as if nothing had happened. The air warmed again, the oppressive August humidity settling back over me like a wet blanket. My ears popped. For a moment I just knelt there, panting, my knuckles white where I gripped the edge of the iron box. My mind was scrambling, trying to stitch together a reality that made sense. Wind. It was just the wind. A freak downdraft. A dust devil. My mind was playing tricks on me. The sound. It was just the air whistling over the edge of the box, that's all. It had to be. But I knew, with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in my gut, that it wasn't. My gaze was locked on the doll. It lay on its bed of brittle, blackened leaves which crumbled into ash-like dust when I poked one with a hesitant finger. The doll felt like the epicenter of it all, the focal point of the unnatural cold and the horrifying sound. The silence of the field was different now. It wasn't peaceful. It was watchful. I felt a primal urge to slam the heavy lid shut, drag the box back to the hole, and bury it so deep no plow would ever find it again. That's what Pops would have done. That's what any sane person would have done. But I looked at that little wooden figure with its sad mouth and mismatched eyes, and I couldn't. It was as if it was calling to me, a silent, magnetic pull. A secret. My secret. With a trembling hand, I reached into the box. The air inside was still frigid. My fingers recoiled at the first touch, but I forced myself, closing them around the doll's smooth wooden body. It was as cold as a river stone. I lifted it out. It was heavier than it looked, solid and dense. I stood up. The doll clutched in my fist, and for a long moment I stared back into the empty black maw of the iron box. The foul smell of decay and damp earth seemed to cling to the air around it. I kicked the lid, and it slammed shut with a final booming clang of finality. I didn't have the strength or the will to rebury it. I left it there, a rusted iron scar on the face of the stubborn acre. The walk back to the tractor was the longest of my life. Every rustle of the corn, every chirp of a cricket, sounded loud and menacing. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something moving in the deepening twilight. I shoved the wooden doll into the front pocket of my jeans. It felt like a lump of ice against my leg. I fired up the John Deere, the familiar roar of the engine a comforting sound in the oppressive quiet. I didn't look back as I drove away. I didn't dare. By the time I got the tractor parked in the barn, night had fallen completely. A sliver of a moon hung in the inky sky, offering little light. The farmhouse windows glowed with a warm, yellow welcome. I could see Dad's silhouette in his armchair through the living room window. For a second, everything felt normal. I almost convinced myself I had imagined the whole thing. Then I felt the cold, hard weight of the doll in my pocket. "There you are," Dad's voice grumbled from the porch swing as I walked up the path. The squeak of its chains was a familiar rhythm of my life. "Thought a gopher might have carried you off. Took you long enough." "Plowshare got caught up on something," I lied, my voice sounding strained to my own ears. "Took a while to work it loose." I couldn't bring myself to look him in the eye. He grunted, taking a long sip from the bottle of beer in his hand. "The stubborn acre," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. "That ground. It don't like being disturbed. It's got a long memory." He stared out into the darkness in the direction of the field, and a shiver I couldn't control ran down my spine. He didn't know how right he was. "I'm going to grab a shower," I mumbled, pushing past him and into the house. The warmth and the smell of Mom's pot roast should have been comforting, but they felt alien, like I'd brought the cold of the field in with me. I took the stairs 2 at a time, the doll a dead weight in my pocket, and locked myself in my bedroom. My room was my sanctuary. Posters of rock bands and muscle cars on the walls, clothes piled on a chair, the faint smell of teenage sweat and motor oil. It was mine. But tonight it felt different. It felt like I'd invited a stranger in. I pulled the doll from my pocket and set it on my nightstand, next to my alarm clock. Under the yellow glow of my bedside lamp, it looked even more forlorn. The dark wood seemed to drink the light. The single white button eye stared blankly at the ceiling, while the black one seemed to stare right at me. I could see the faint knife marks where it had been carved, the whirls of the wood grain like ancient fingerprints. Who made you, I wondered? Who put you in that box and buried you so deep? I took my shower, letting the hot water run over me until my skin was red, trying to wash away the chill that had sunk deep into my bones. It didn't work. When I came back into my room, wrapped in a towel, the air was cold. My window was closed. The AC wasn't on, but there was a distinct draft. I walked over to the nightstand. The doll was sitting exactly where I'd left it, but the room felt occupied. The silence was thick, heavy. I got dressed, my movements quick and jerky, My nerves stretched thin. I kept glancing at the doll. Its sorrowful little face seemed to mock my fear. "It's just a piece of wood," I whispered to myself, the words sounding hollow. "You're losing it." I had to get it out of my room. Out of the house. I picked it up. Its coldness was immediate and startling. I opened my closet door, intending to toss it into the back corner and forget about it. My closet was a black hole of old sports equipment, forgotten schoolbooks, and dirty laundry. I raised my hand to throw it in, but I hesitated. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness inside, I saw something. On the back wall of the closet, low to the ground, were scratches. 4 parallel lines, gouged deep into the wood of the wall, as if an animal had been clawing to get out. But these weren't animal scratches. They looked fresh, and they were the perfect size to have been made by the tiny, stick-like fingers of the doll I was holding in my hand. My blood ran cold. I slammed the closet door shut, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. My breath hitched in my throat. This was impossible. It had to be old damage I'd never noticed before. It had to be. Shaking, I put the doll back on the nightstand. I needed to sleep. I needed to forget. I killed the light and climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin. I lay there in the dark, my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. I listened. For a long time, there was nothing but the familiar symphony of an old farmhouse at night. The groan of the settling foundation, the hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the distant call of a whip-poor-will. Slowly, ever so slowly, the frantic beating of my heart began to slow. My eyelids grew heavy. Maybe Dad was right. Maybe that ground just had a long memory, and I'd stirred up some bad air. Maybe tomorrow, in the light of day, it would all seem foolish. I was just starting to drift off, my mind finally letting go of the fear, when I heard it. A sound from right beside my bed, so soft I almost missed it. Thump. It was the distinct, unmistakable sound of a small, solid piece of wood hitting the floorboards, as if something had just hopped off my nightstand. My body went rigid, every muscle locked, every nerve ending screaming. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just listened, straining my ears in the suffocating darkness of my room. The house was silent again. The refrigerator hum had stopped. Even the whip-poor-will outside had fallen quiet. It was a dead, waiting silence, the kind of silence that has weight. I told myself it was nothing. The house settling, a book falling over. My lamp was old. Maybe a piece of it had come loose. I ran through 100 rational explanations, each one more flimsy than the last, because I knew. In the deepest, most primitive part of my brain, I knew exactly what that sound was. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, my eyes burning from staring into the blackness. My ears ached from the effort of listening. Nothing. Maybe I had imagined it. A waking dream, brought on by a day of heat, exhaustion, and a spooky discovery. Yes, that was it. I was just freaking myself out over a creepy old toy. My heartbeat began to slow from a frantic gallop to a heavy, pounding thud. I slowly, carefully let out the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. And then I heard the second sound. Scrape, drag, scrape. It was coming from the floor, near the foot of my bed. A soft, rhythmic, dragging sound. The sound of rough wood being pulled slowly, deliberately, across the worn floorboards of my room. My blood turned to ice. This wasn't a settling house. This wasn't a waking dream. This was real. Something was moving in my room. Something that had been on my nightstand just moments before. A wave of pure, unadulterated terror washed over me, so potent it was nauseating. My fight-or-flight instinct kicked in, but I was paralyzed. My body refused to obey my brain's frantic commands to run, to scream, to do something. I was a kid again, frozen by the monster I was sure lived under my bed. But this monster wasn't under the bed. It was in the room with me. Scrape, drag, scrape. It was closer now, moving around the side of the bed, toward my head. I squeezed my eyes shut, as if not seeing it would make it disappear. A stupid, childish impulse. The smell hit me then, the same smell from the box. Damp earth, rotting leaves, and something else, something metallic and vaguely sweet, like old pennies. The smell of decay, the smell of the grave. It filled my nostrils, thick and cloying. I could feel it now. A presence, a cold spot in the air, right next to my head. I could feel the temperature in the room plummeting, the lingering August heat being sucked away, replaced by the same unnatural chill from the field. My own breath plumed in front of my face in the darkness. My teeth began to chatter uncontrollably. I had to see it. I had to know. Forcing my leaden eyelids open, I slowly, infinitesimally, turned my head on the pillow. The sliver of moonlight filtering through my window was weak, but it was enough. What I saw will be burned into my memory until the day I die. The doll was standing on the floor next to my bed. Standing. Its little stick-like legs, which I'd assumed were fused together, were somehow supporting its weight. Its head was tilted up, and in the faint moonlight, the mismatched button eyes seemed to glint with a malevolent intelligence. The pearly white one caught the light, gleaming like a wet eyeball. The black one was a pit of shadow. It was just standing there, watching me. Its downturned carved mouth looked less like sorrow now, and more like a sneer. A choked whimper escaped my throat. The sound seemed to break the spell. The doll took a step. It wasn't a walk. It was a horrible, jerking lurch, dragging one wooden foot forward with a scraping sound, then the other. It was moving towards the head of my bed, towards my pillow, towards me. That's when the paralysis finally broke. I moved faster than I ever have in my life. I let out a strangled yell and threw myself backwards, scrambling over the side of the bed and landing in a heap on the floor against the far wall. My heart was trying to punch its way out of my chest. I crab-walked backward until my back was pressed hard against the wall, pulling my knees up to my chest like a shield. I fumbled for the lamp on my desk, my hand shaking so violently I knocked over a stack of books. Finally, my fingers found the switch. I flicked it on. The room was flooded with harsh yellow light. The doll was gone. I scanned the floor frantically. It wasn't there. It wasn't by the bed. It wasn't anywhere. My eyes darted to the nightstand. It was sitting there, right next to my alarm clock, exactly where I'd put it, perfectly still. Its button eyes stared blankly at the ceiling. The sad, carved mouth was just a sad, carved mouth. Was I going insane? Had I actually fallen asleep and had the most vivid, terrifying nightmare of my life? My body screamed otherwise. My pulse was still a frantic drum solo. My skin was slick with cold sweat, and the rank smell of grave dirt still hung heavy in the air. I stayed there, huddled against the wall, for what must have been half an hour, just staring at the doll, waiting for it to move. It didn't. It was just a block of wood. An ugly, creepy, unsettling block of wood. I couldn't stay in the room with it. I couldn't sleep. I snatched my jeans off the floor, pulled them on, and grabbed the doll from the nightstand. The wood was no longer cold. It was warm. Not just warm, but radiating a faint, living heat, like it had been held in front of a fire, or like it had a fever. The feeling was so repulsive I almost dropped it. I shoved it deep into my pocket, grabbed my truck keys, and fled the room, leaving the light on. I crept down the stairs, wincing at every creak, and slipped out the back door into the humid night. I didn't know where I was going. I just drove. I turned onto the main road and pushed the old pickup as fast as it would go. The windows down, the warm night air rushing in, trying to blow the smell of the grave and the memory of those scraping footsteps out of my head. For miles, I just drove aimlessly through the sleeping Indiana countryside, past darkened farmhouses and silent fields of corn. The doll was a hot, heavy lump in my pocket. I could feel its presence, even over the roar of the engine. Finally, a plan started to form in my mind. A desperate, half-baked plan. I couldn't destroy it. The thought of trying to burn it or smash it filled me with a primal dread, as if I knew it would be useless, or worse, that it would just make it angry. I couldn't keep it. But I couldn't just throw it away either. What if someone else found it? A kid? The thought was chilling. No, it had to go back where it came from. I turned the truck around and headed back towards the farm. Not to the house, but to the stubborn acre. I parked at the edge of the field, the headlights cutting a swath of white through the darkness. The rusted iron box was still there, a dark, hulking shape in the middle of the plowed earth. Leaving the engine running and the lights on, I got out of the truck. The field was alive with the sound of crickets, but it felt different from before. It didn't feel watchful anymore. It felt hungry. I walked out to the box, my boots crunching on the dry soil. The pry bar was lying where I'd left it. I wedged it into the seam, and with a groan of effort, heaved the heavy lid open once more. The foul, cold air washed over me again, but I was ready for it this time. I reached into my pocket, my fingers recoiling from the doll's unnatural heat. I pulled it out. In the stark glare of the truck's headlights, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. On the back of the doll's featureless head, almost hidden in the dark wood, was a series of tiny carved letters. They were crude and shaky, like a child had etched them with a nail. I tilted it to the light to read them. There were only 5 letters, spelling out a name, Elise. As my lips formed the name in a silent whisper, a new sound came from the box. It wasn't the wind this time. It was a soft, wet, scrabbling noise, a sound coming from the deep, absolute darkness within the empty iron chest. It was the sound of something shifting, something moving, something turning over. My blood ran cold. The scrabbling sound from inside the box was hideously organic, like a rat moving through wet leaves, but heavier, deeper. My hand, holding the doll named Elise, was frozen halfway to the opening. Every instinct screamed at me to drop it, to run back to the truck and never look back. But I was mesmerized by the horror, pinned in place by the headlights, a deer caught in the glare of a supernatural freight train. The scrabbling stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse, pregnant with a terrible anticipation. I stared into the black rectangle of the box, my eyes straining to pierce the shadows. The smell of rot and damp earth intensified, so thick I could taste it on the back of my tongue. And then I saw it. 2 pinpricks of light, reflecting the truck's headlights from the very bottom of the box. They weren't metal or glass. They gleamed with a faint, wet luminescence. They were eyes, and they were looking right at me. A low growl rumbled up from the darkness, a sound that vibrated not in the air, but deep in my chest. It was a sound of pure malevolence, ancient and predatory. This was the thing that had howled. This was the voice in the wind. And the box wasn't its prison, it was its lair. The doll in my hand suddenly felt searingly hot, like a coal plucked from a fire. The name carved into its head. Elise seemed to burn against my thoughts. I finally understood. The doll wasn't the evil thing. It was a lock, a seal, a focus. It was an anchor for whatever spirit or memory was tied to this cursed piece of land. And by removing it, I had unlocked the door. The eyes in the box blinked slowly, deliberately. A shape began to resolve itself in the shadows, something pale and twisted, unfurling like a rotted fern. I didn't wait to see more. In a moment of pure, instinct-driven panic, I did the only thing I could think of. I threw the doll, Elise, back into the box. It landed with a soft, dull thud on the bed of blackened leaves. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. The glowing eyes remained fixed on me. The growl deepened. Then the doll's own button eyes, the pearly white and the chipped black, began to glow with a soft, ethereal blue light. The light pulsed once, twice, a soft, sorrowful heartbeat in the oppressive darkness. A different sound rose from the box then, not a growl, but a high, piercing shriek of rage and pain. The 2 wet, luminous eyes widened in shock, then vanished as if snuffed out. The horrible pale shape convulsed and seemed to dissolve back into the shadows. The cold receded. The smell of the grave faded, replaced by the honest scent of plowed dirt and night air. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the heavy iron lid and slammed it down with all my strength. The boom echoed across the silent field. I fumbled for the pry bar, using it to hammer the edges of the lid, bending the rusted metal, doing my best to reseal the seam I had so foolishly broken. It was a crude, desperate act, but it felt necessary. It felt like I was closing a door that should never have been opened. Panting, covered in rust and cold sweat, I stumbled back to my truck. I didn't stop to think. I put the John Deere in gear and drove it right up to the box. I lowered the heavy plowshares, and with a roar of the engine, I did the one thing I should have done from the very beginning. I buried it. I pushed mounds of dirt over it, the tractor groaning under the strain. I drove back and forth, packing the earth down, burying it deeper than any plow would ever reach again. I kept going until the sun started to stain the eastern sky with shades of gray and pink. The rusted iron box and its terrible secret were once again part of the stubborn acre. I never told anyone what happened. Not my parents, not Jenny Abernathy, not a single soul. How could I? That I'd found a haunted box, that a wooden doll had walked across my bedroom floor. They'd have thought I was crazy, or drunk, or both. They wouldn't have understood the chilling reality of it, the weight of the secret I now carried. Life on the farm went on. The seasons turned. I graduated high school, and instead of leaving for college like most of my friends, I stayed. The farm, which had once felt like a prison, now felt like a duty. I was its guardian. I was the keeper of the stubborn acre's secret. My dad eventually retired, his back finally giving out, and I took over the running of the place. He'd watch me from the porch swing, and sometimes he'd get a strange look in his eye when he saw me staring out at that 30-acre plot. One evening, years later, we were sitting on that same porch swing, watching another Indiana sunset bleed out over the fields. I was a man now, my hands calloused and my face weathered like his. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the chains of the swing squeaking a familiar rhythm. "You never did tell me what you hit with the plow that day," he said, his voice quiet. He wasn't looking at me, but at the stubborn acre. My heart jumped into my throat. I just shook my head. "Just a big rock, Pops. Nothing more." He was quiet for a long time, sipping his beer. "My grandpappy," he said finally, his voice a low rasp. "He used to tell a story about the family that lived on this land before us, the Millers. They had a little girl, Elise. She went missing one winter. They searched for weeks, the whole county did. Never found her. They said the grief drove her folks mad. They just vanished not long after, and the land went fallow." I stared at him, my blood running cold for the first time in years. "You never told me that." He took another long sip, his eyes still fixed on that distant field. "Some stories ain't for telling to boys. They're for men to carry." He turned and looked me square in the eye. His gaze was heavy, filled with an understanding that went beyond words. "Whatever you buried back out there, son, you did right to leave it be. Some things, they just want to be left alone. Some stories are better left in the dirt." He never mentioned it again, and neither did I. But I knew that he knew. Maybe not the details, but he knew the soul of it. He knew the land remembers. I still farm the stubborn acre, but I never plow it deep. I plant shallow-rooted crops, like soybeans or alfalfa. And every time I drive the tractor over that one particular spot, even after all these years, the air gets a little colder. I hear a faint, sorrowful whisper on the wind, and I always say her name out loud, a quiet apology to the little girl with the button eyes, the guardian who was buried in the dark. "I'm sorry, Elise," I say, and I keep on driving, because I know that some doors once closed must remain shut forever.